Hey everybody, today we're going to be brewing up a Saison. This is a beer that actually came from the French-speaking territory of Belgium. It's actually a really cool type of beer. There's a lot of different variations to it, so you can kind of add your own spin to it anytime you want. It's nice and light, actually makes for a really good kind of a lawnmower beer, even though you don't normally see a lot of Belgian beers that are kind of lawnmower beers, but it's very light, crisp, refreshing. Kind of the history behind it is that the landowners used to make it for their workers on the farms, and so usually it was only about a 3% beer. The one that we're going to do today is going to be closer to about 5.5%. And it actually goes all the way up to 7% now. But you'll hear a lot of times people also use the words farmhouse ale or something like that, and it's kind of the same concept. You have some really cool yeast in there. So right now we're just heating up the water. Of course, this is going to be an all-grain recipe. So we're getting about 5.5 gallons of hot water right now. This is a 10-gallon recipe. I'll post the recipe on the site. We'll also put it right here. Alright, so right now we're trying to get this up to about 165 degrees. Once we add 5.5 gallons of 165 degree water to approximately 20 pounds of room temperature grain, we're aiming for about 152 degrees. So we should hit pretty close to that. I like to do a pretty thick mash and leave myself a little bit of room to add a little hot water or cold water to raise the temperature or drop it. So I'll usually keep like a tea kettle around that's almost boiling, and then some ice cold water hanging around so that I can just kind of bump that up or down as needed. So we're at 165 right now, so we're about ready to mash in. Alright, so I just took half of that water and added it into this the mash tun. I like to keep the other half until I've mixed in some of the grains, not putting all the water in at once. So we have that nice 165 degree water in here. We're about to start adding those grains. I like to give it a good spin before I start adding the grains. That way things don't clump up. You'll get some really big dough balls in there if you just dump it right in. So let's mix it in. Alright, so we got that water spinning around. Here comes the grain. So we'll keep mixing this in for the next couple of minutes, adding more and more grain. Probably about halfway through adding the grain here, I'll add the rest of that water so it doesn't get too thick and things don't clump up too much. And then we'll mix for a couple minutes until it's nice and homogenized. Nothing's funner than watching somebody mix a big pot of mash. So I was initially a couple degrees low, so I got out our electric tea kettle here. It's kind of an easy way to get some really hot water real fast. Dumped it in there, and as you can see, we are now at 152.2 degrees, which is a great spot to be. We'll probably lose about a half a degree over the next hour while this sits. So gave it a real good stir. So right now it is breaking down some of those starches and turning them into sugars for the yeast to eventually eat as beer. So I realized I just breezed past the whole 152 degree thing, so I just wanted to take a second to make sure that you know why we're doing that. Basically there are enzymes on the grain that break down the starches and turn them into sugars. And at different temperatures, those starches are broken down at different lengths. So that you'll often hear short chain sugars or long chain sugars. The short ones are broken down at a lower temperatures, right around 148, 149 degrees. That makes it a very fermentable wort. So that means that it's going to be a very dry beer. If you want something with a little more body to it, you up the temperature to maybe 153, 154, and that's when you get the longer chain sugars, dextrins, and that gives it a lot more body, kind of gives it the more of a mouthfeel to the beer. So we're aiming for 152 because the Saison is kind of intended to be kind of right in the middle of the road there. Alright, so I'm going to be getting together some orange peel and coriander for the Saison. That's pretty typical for the style. So we're going to use 2 tablespoons worth of coriander. What I'm going to actually end up doing is putting it in the plastic bag, and I'll crush it with the rolling pin. But I wanted to show you what I'm doing with the orange. What I like to do is I'll use the real large grate on the cheese grater and just kind of take off the outer edge of the peel. You don't want to get the pith on the inside, that white stuff. You just want this really orangey, oily stuff on the outside. Then I'll put it on the pan and put it in the oven for about 10 minutes at 170 degrees. And what you'll see happens is the skin will actually pull tight and the oil gets kind of pushed out of it. So you get a really nice extraction from it. So that's what I'll do with the orange peel. For a sec here, let's just take some of this coriander and put it in the bag. And I'll show you what we're going to do to get a good crush. Some people will put this into like a coffee grinder. I find that it's very hard to not have it turn into almost powder. You'll see it. You'll see some of the grains that won't get affected at all. They'll be whole, and then the rest of it will turn into total powder. So if you can, if you're not doing 10 barrels of the stuff, just put it in a bag, just lay it out on a cutting board, and then hit it with your rolling pin, and you can hear them all crunching. All you're really trying to do is get them to all pop in half, and so you can already see it. They're starting to pop in half there. So I'll just kind of crush them a few times like that, and then what we'll end up doing is we'll end up putting the coriander and the orange peel, once that's all dehydrated, we'll put it into the same sack that we're putting in the last hops, so the whirlpool hops. And that way we don't have to worry about having to clean up a bunch of chunks of orange out of the brew. So while that mash is going, we filled up a couple more pots of water. This is going to be the sparge water. So basically that mash is breaking down those sugars, or the starches, into sugar right now. And then once we end up pouring off a lot of that, we're going to pour some hot water in there again and kind of rinse off the rest of those sugars so that we can get everything possible out of that. So that's what this is. We're aiming for about 180 degrees on these because really you want the mash to get to about 170. That turns off all of the enzymes. It makes so they're not breaking anything down anymore. You're just extracting as much of those last sugars as possible. We have 2 pots here. We're aiming for 180 while that mash finishes up. So it's been about an hour now, so all those sugars should have been converted inside of our mash. So what we're going to do is we're going to start pouring off some of the liquid at the bottom of this. Now we have a screen running across the bottom, and there's several different ways of having that screen, and we can go into, we'll probably have a whole other episode just dedicated to some of the equipment. But mine is what's called a bazooka tube. There's a screen tube that runs across the bottom. And as I start pouring out of here, you're going to see it comes out really murky. There's going to be little chunks of grain in there. There's all sorts of stuff in there. So this is called the Vorlauf pour, which is where we start pouring into. I use a nice clear pitcher. I fill most of the way, and then I'm going to start pouring it back into the top. Once you do that 3 or 4 times, what you'll see is the grain starts to settle down and it creates what is called the grain bed. And that's basically just a giant filter. And that filter will start taking all those bits out of it and it'll start actually pouring pretty clear. So that's what we're going to start right now, is our first pours in here. We usually go pretty slow at the beginning. You don't want all that grain to rush into the screen real fast and clog it up. So I go nice and slow at the beginning. It's a little tedious. It takes a little while for you to be able to fill up a few of these pitchers. but it's definitely worth it for clarity and quality later on. So rather than fill that all the way up, I'll show you what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to shut that down. It's already got a really nice smell to it. Let the last of that pour out. And we'll go up to the top here. And some people have really elaborate ways of being able to spray this back on top. So that it drizzles really lightly on there. I'm not that worried just because the grain bed in this is so thick. Us doing a 10-gallon batch out of this means that there's just a huge grain bed to this. So I really will just put a spoon in the way and just kind of let it drizzle through there. It just spreads it out a bit, just so that I'm not digging a hole right through the middle of that grain bed. But other than that, I'm not terribly worried. If you're doing a 5-gallon batch, then you might... some people I've seen also just set a plate, and you'll see the plate will set down on top of the grain, and then they just pour right on top of the plate, and it just kind of drizzles around the outside. I've used a silicone little, kind of like a colander that you would use for steaming vegetables. That actually works great. You set it right on there, and you just pour right onto it, and it just kind of sprinkles the water around. So you kind of come up with your own ways of being able to make it so you don't dig a hole straight through the grain bed. That's all you're trying to avoid here. So now I'm going to pour back in here another 4 or 5 times just to be able to get that to start running clear. And then we'll start the sparge. So when the pros do this, they'll actually have a pump. It's kind of cool. The tube would run into a pump and then come back into the top, and then it has a spraying arm, and so it's constantly recirculating. So it's kind of nice for those guys because they can actually just walk away and give it 15 or 20 minutes. And then in the tube, they have a little glass little window there that they can see how clear it's getting. So, you know, when they first start running it, it's coming across. It almost looks like milk. It's got so much stuff in it. But by the end, you know, it looks like a Coors Light or something like that. Like it's extremely clear by the time they're done with it. And then suddenly they'll just hit a button and it'll switch the direction that the wort is pouring from recirculating back in there into the boil kettle. So it's kind of nice if you can afford one of those systems. So we're getting pretty close. There's definitely no chunks in it anymore. It's got a little murkiness to it, so I'll probably do one more of these, and then I'll start just pouring off into the boil kettle there. And of course the boil kettle is just one large kettle, nothing fancy to it at all. You can do some extras in there where you set up a whirlpool arm and different ways of extracting the wort at the end, where you can put a little barrier in there to not have a bunch of the trub or like the hop material and stuff like that come across. But mine is pretty basic. So if you're starting out, you can just get yourself a nice big kettle like this and boil in there, and it means that you have to do a little bit of the extra work yourself, but it's not a big deal. So this is my last boil off here. I'm now pouring straight into the boil kettle. So after a minute or two of doing that, I'll probably start up the fire. Because that's one of the things that'll slow you down the most, is when you're trying to bring the heat up. A lot of liquid takes a lot of fire to be able to do it. So here in a minute, once you've got an inch or two worth of liquid down there, I'll start up the propane tank and let that start heating up while we're doing all the sparge. Alright, so here's that orange peel that I was talking about. We've now warmed it up in the oven. We didn't really get it hot enough to toast it or anything like that. It was really just meant to dehydrate it a bit. So now it's kind of got a little bit of a crunchiness to it, and there's a lot of oils. Like when I touch it, I get oils all over my fingers. So that's exactly what we want. We'll end up putting that with that nice crushed coriander. into a hop sack for the last hops, and that's where we get all that really cool flavor. Alright, so it's time to sparge now. As you can see, some of the grain is starting to poke out over here, and we don't want it to get really dry. There's a couple ways to sparge, and there's some arguments about which one's better. The one that we're gonna do, we're gonna add some water onto this and just kind of keep it above. That's called fly sparging. There's also a batch sparge where you just let the thing run completely dry. You dump a whole new batch of water in there. You stir it around. You do the Vorlauf again. That's actually a great way to do it, especially if you're just starting out. You get a really good efficiency off of it. It's just not the way that the pros do it, because they don't really have enough room to be able to keep filling that whole vessel up with water over and over, and it would really slow them down. So we're going to do more their style, where we try and keep a good bed of water over the top of this. So this is that nice 180-degree water. There's that colander I was talking about. It just helps to kind of distribute the liquid. And so we're going to do this a little chunk at a time. Like I said, there are some folks that have really elaborate arms that are over the top, that they pour the water in and it sprinkles it really nice. That's great. It's not necessary if you're starting out. So this has worked great for me. So another thing I like to do is occasionally I'll go through and I'll kind of scrape the very top of the grain bed just real lightly, because what I have seen before is you'll get, after the water keeps pouring through, you'll actually see cracks start to develop in the grain bed where liquid starts to pour down through those cracks. You see it a lot for the pros, just because they have, 1,000 pounds of grain there, but it happens on the homebrew level as well. So it's nice to every now and then just kind of very lightly scrape the top, and it'll help kind of redistribute some of that grain, just in case you've had some openings. Alright, that's about half of our liquid. Things are coming along real nicely down there. I'm going to actually start the fire now. Alright, so we're starting up the fire here. We started out kind of low. There's all sorts of different burners. This is just the regular Bayou burner. It does a pretty good job. I've seen some that are for the really good home brewers that really rip out a lot of gas. And so they can heat things up really fast. I do notice that those ones, though, you'll get a lot of like char, some carbon on the outside. So I think that you have to adjust the oxygen levels. This one's pretty basic, pretty easy to use for beginners, and I never really have a problem with getting the right amount of heat later on. So there's always better versions of every product here. It's smelling really nice. It's good, grainy. As you can see by the recipe that's in there, it's got a lot of Pilsner malt, which always makes for a great aroma. It's just got such a nice grainy smell. So I think this is going to be a good one. Alright, so we've been boiling for about 25 minutes now. So we're almost ready to put in our 60-minute addition. So what I like to do is set everything out and start bagging things up ahead of time. So this is our 60-minute addition. That means that it's going in 60 minutes before the end of the boil. So it's going to have a full 60 minutes of time in that boiling liquid. This is our 10-minute addition. So we've got our East Kent Goldings, and then I also like to set out my Whirlflock tablets as well as the yeast nutrient, because otherwise I'll forget that later on. And then last we have a whole lot of Czech Saaz, which is just a great late addition hop. It adds kind of a nice spicy character. So I'm going to put all those in one of these hop sacks. And then I laid out the orange peel as well as the coriander, so those will actually go in with the hops. So it's all together at the very end. So I'm going to bag those up right now, and then we'll add that to the boiling wort. Alright, so I just like to put that over there. add those hop pellets. Alright, it'll smell amazing. Alright, it's time to go add that to the boil. Alright, so this is one of my favorite moments in the brewing process because right now everything smells so nice and grainy. There's this sweet bread smell that's coming off of it, but there aren't any hops in there. And once you add this little bag of hops, suddenly it just explodes with that really cool aroma. So I'm adding that in there, just like pushing down. And yeah, there's just an instant, almost minty herbal smell because of the type of hops that we're throwing in there. It is just incredible. So that was our 1 hour edition. We've got a little bit of time now because the next edition doesn't hit until 10 minutes before the end of the boil. So this is a good time to kind of empty out your grain and do some cleaning around the area so that you're all set when that time comes. Alright, so we're 10 minutes from the end of the boil. So that's when we're going to end up throwing in our yeast nutrient, our whirl flock, and some of our the 10-minute additions of the hops. But first what I'm going to do is throw in the copper coil that we use to cool. You definitely want to get one of these if you don't have one already. They have 50 footers, 25 footers, they have ones made of stainless steel, copper. They're all great. It makes a huge difference in your brew day. You just set it down in there for the last 10-15 minutes of the boil. And it'll help disinfect anything on there. So you definitely wash it at the end of every brew. You know, hit it with the sani clean and stuff like that. But you can toss it in there, give it 10 minutes of time, and that thing will be completely sterile. So now we got 10-minute additions. This is our East Kent Golding hops. These ones are all pellets, so I'm not actually going to put them in a hop sack. I'm just going to dump them straight in there. I got another one. Just going to dump straight into there. And then we've got the whirl flock tablets. Usually you're doing one of these for every 5 gallons. So this being a 10-gallon batch, I'm going to put 2 of them in there. And they are just Irish moss, which is just another way of saying a specific type of sea kelp. So 1, 2. Those will fizz around. And as you can see, some hot water is getting pushed out of there by the pressure. It's not a big deal. And then we've got some yeast nutrient. About a tablespoon would do it. You can kind of eyeball it. It's hard to give too much of that yeast nutrient. It's mostly zinc that the yeast is lacking, and so they do a specific type of yeast that eats a ton of zinc, and then they kill it off. And then we're adding that into the boil, and so those yeast cells burst open and release all that zinc. So that's our 10-minute addition. This is a great time to start getting things ready for turning off your fire. So if you're not going to end up cooling in the same place that you were using your burner, then this is a good time to start getting that other area ready. So I'm going to set up another area because I don't like to do my cooling inside the garage because I'm going to be running hose water. So yep, that's our 10-minute addition. Time to get everything ready for the end. Alright, so we've got the 3 ounces of Czech Saaz hops in here, as well as the orange peel and the coriander. So that's ready to go in there. We've hit our 90 minutes worth of boil time. So it's time to shut off the fire. And then we'll drop this in there, kind of stir it around, and we'll let it slowly cool over the next 10 minutes while we move this out into the area that we're going to go to run the hose water through it. So this is kind of like it doing its own little whirlpool right now. So I'm just going to drop that on in there, push it down. You can already smell a little bit of that orange coming up and the coriander. And I love the smell of those Czech Saaz. They've just got such a cool little spicy smell to them. Alright, so that's doing its thing. Time to move everything out. Alright, so we just moved outside. I just plugged in some hose water through my chiller. So as you can see, it's coming through. I like to make sure and capture a couple buckets of that nice hot water. It's great for cleaning things. So I'll throw in my oxygen cleaner or PBW or whatever it is that you're going to use as your actual cleanser. I'll put it in a bucket and start filling that with some nice hot water. And that'll come in handy later on. Then I'll take some extra water and throw it into the buckets that I'm actually going to end up using to ferment in, or your carboy or whatever you're going to do, and I'll add some sanitizer to that. So in my case, I've got the 5-star Star San. That stuff works great, but whatever kind of sanitizer you're going to use, just throw that into the bucket with some of the water that's coming off of here and swish it around and let it soak in there for the 30 minutes that you're kind of chilling all this down. So it's nice to be able to not waste all that water if at all possible. So now it's just going to all be about keeping this liquid moving so that it cools a little faster. If you don't keep it moving, you will create kind of a bubble of cool wort in there and everything else will stay blazing hot. A little thing to add, make sure that you're doing this in the right kind of weather. If it's a warm, summery day or something like that, you can run into real problems with wild yeast that's blowing around. Right now, I don't like that it's been a little breezy today, but at least it's late fall, so the air is pretty clean here right now. But if it's midsummer or something like that, a breeze comes through, you can see the pollen just blowing around. So the best days, honestly, are rainy days and maybe snowy days if you're in a really cold environment. So just something to keep in mind for when you're doing your brews. Alright, so we've been cooling down that wort for about the last 20 minutes or so. So I'd say right now we're probably at about 75 degrees. So we're just kind of cooling down our last couple degrees. I've got our Sani over there, so sanitizer, and some lids are in it, as well as the little airlocks are soaking in there. This is our oxygen cleaner right here. And so we're getting to that moment where I'm going to probably take the chiller out and put the wort into our buckets. They've been sanitized and are ready to rock. The reason I'm not going as cool as usual, like I usually like to start my fermentation off at about 66 or 67 degrees when it comes to an ale, which this is considered an ale yeast. Normally I go down that low, but since it's a Saison, you actually want that to have a little bit more yeast character in there. Now there are some people who will go into the 80s, 85, 90 degrees. Part of that is because of the type of yeast they're using. They're going to use the Belgian Saison, which is the classic kind of DuPont style. That tends to putter out about halfway through the job, and so you end up having to heat it up a lot to be able to finish consuming all the sugars. The nice thing with the French Saison yeast, which is the one I'm using right now, and it's the one that's in the recipe, that is on Wyeast, it's the 3711 yeast, is it does not stop. It just keeps cranking through. It still gives some really neat Belgian characteristics, but it doesn't putter out halfway through. So you can get a nice dry Saison. Like I say, we should be probably in the mid 70s by now. Yeah, it's cold outside, so it's going pretty fast. So it's looking like we're probably about 76 right now, which is fine. Like I say, mid 70s for this. I'll probably put it in a little bit of a cool place overnight and just let it kind of relax at about 72, 71 degrees. But that whole 85 degree, that worries me too much. I feel like the yeast can eventually die at temperatures like that, and they'll burst. The actual yeast cell walls will burst, and you'll get kind of weird off flavors, and you don't want any of that. So I'd say this is a good temperature for us. So I'm going to take out our cooler. Just set it right in there. It's just some fresh, clean water, and I'll end up sanitizing that later on. Like I said, these buckets are already ready to go, and I even wiped to the edge of the rim over here with a sanitizer to get everything clean. It's nice if you have two people doing this, but you know, you kind of figure out how to use leverage. So we should have just about 10 gallons on the dot. Might be a little short on this one. Seemed like about 9.5 gallons. There you go. And I'm going to leave some of the stuff behind. There's some of the chunks of the hops. We don't really want any, as much of that as we can leave behind, the better. People who have really nice systems will actually get a whirlpool going there, and they'll get this little trube cone in the middle, and so they can actually pour off some really clear beer or clear wort. That's once you get the deluxe system. For now, if you've just got this kind of a kettle, you can still produce great beer with that. The next step is going to be oxygen, and adding the yeast and adding a anti-foaming agent. So we'll do that in just a sec. Alright, so we're about to aerate the wort. This is one area where I do not like skimping. A lot of folks will say, oh, we'll just put the wort in a bucket, put a lid on it that doesn't have a hole, and just shake it real hard. And I used to do that. I did it for a little while. But everything always had that, what they kind of call the homebrew flavor. And I think it's really, a lot of times, it's just that you don't have a complete fermentation. And it's because a lot of times the yeast is running out of oxygen. Once you add pure oxygen to your wort, you'll see everything dries out really well. You'll have great fermentation. So it's definitely worth doing. You know, the oxygen tank itself, it's like $8 at a Home Depot. The wand and everything you can get from your homebrew store. It comes with a regulator. It'll be about $45, maybe $50. So it's definitely worth doing, though. It was my biggest improvement when it came to a piece of equipment. So it's been sitting in sanitizer. My hands are super sandy. So I'm just going to crank this on, and you'll start seeing oxygen come out of the tip over here. See, it's all foaming now. I'm going to hit it one more time with some quick Sani, and then we're going to put it in there. And I like this model because it has that stainless steel wand, and I just start swirling it around. Kind of put it down towards the bottom, and I give it about 35 seconds, maybe 45 seconds worth of oxygen, kind of depending on the style of beer. If we were doing like a giant Russian Imperial Stout, I'd probably actually come back tomorrow morning and give it even more oxygen because it can come out of solution overnight. But that's looking pretty good. Alright, and then I'll do the same over here. Get that moving. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a few drops of silicone. They have it in a liquid form, and it helps break up the bubbles on top, the foam on top. And don't worry, it doesn't mess with the head retention later on. In fact, in speaking with some professional brewers, they think that they get better head retention later on because you haven't used some of those bubble forming proteins. There you go. It's all done with that. It just makes it so that you don't also have an explosive fermentation and it launches foam out of the top. So it kind of depends on the recipe, but they say you can go up to 10 drops. I find that about 5 or 6 usually does the trick pretty well. That's 6. And then if you don't know how to make a good yeast starter, check out like How to Brew by John Palmer. He's got a great little section in his book. Pretty much every brewing book is going to have a section about making starters. I'm going to put a video online. It'll be a short one just about making a good starter, but it is crucial. You know, you have lively yeast that's already eating sugars and is ready to go. You can sometimes multiply the amount of yeast that are alive in there, the viable yeast that are in there, by like 10, 20, depends on how many steps you want to do. But it really helps it take off fast. So right before, I've already decanted some of the old beer out of here because basically I made a weak beer. It's been eating, the yeast has been eating all the sugar. So there's some kind of weak beer in there. I already decanted some of that off. But I left quite a bit behind. I mean, it doesn't really mess with the flavor that much. And this is about 1,000 milliliters, so 1 liter worth of starter. but it's got 2 packets of the Wyeast 3711 French Saison yeast, and it's been extremely active over the last 48 hours, so it is ready to get in there and do its job. So, and it's a nice sanitary vessel. I like using a stainless steel vessel like this instead of the glass ones because, well, obviously glass breaks. I can put this right into ice cold water even with boiling hot liquid in there and never worry that it's going to shatter because of temperature changes. Yeah, so it's just for safety issues. It's also nice and dark. You don't have to worry about light getting in there or anything. So we've had these lids going for a while here. I've been sanitizing them real well. So I'm just going to drop that right onto there. I'll drop this one onto there. Ready to seal it up. I don't think I forgot anything. And I've got the airlocks in here. They've been just hanging out, getting nice and clean. So just a typical airlock. You can buy them for 50 cents at your homebrew store. Keep them nice and clean. Just needs a little bit of liquid in there. I've seen people put vodka in them and stuff like that. I just let whatever little bit of sani is hanging out in there just do its job. There's actually the other style is this big kind you've probably all seen that just has a little bubble thing in it. Only lets air pass in one direction. So he's nice and clean too. And those are ready to rock. I'll check back in about 4 or 5 hours and see if bubbles are already starting to come through. I expect them to, since we had that nice starter going. There shouldn't be any lag to it at all. And if it still isn't really vigorous by tomorrow morning, I'll actually come back with that oxygen wand and I'll hit it again for just maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, kind of give it a stir. That gets the yeast back in solution in case they did happen to go to sleep overnight, gets them a little extra shot of oxygen, and at that point they'll take off like that if they weren't already. Ready to take the fermenters inside. I'm going to get them a nice cool spot. Just wanted to follow up and let you know you'll probably let that ferment for a good 12 to 14 days. Even as you start seeing the bubbles slow down, I like to let it have another week after that. It doesn't seem like a whole lot's going on, but if there was any diacetyl or anything bad that might have been created during the vigorous initial fermentation, the yeast come back to later on. And so what I like to do, and this is highly recommended by a lot of the better brewers, is that you'll do it's a diacetyl rest. So you'll ferment at whatever your temperature. In this case, I'm going to be fermenting probably around 75 degrees. But right at the very end, the last couple days, when I'm at day maybe 10 or 11 and things seem to have really calmed down, I'm going to let it ramp up just a couple extra degrees. So might let it get up to about 77 degrees. And what ends up happening is the yeast kind of wake up, they don't know what to do, they get really hungry, and so they actually start looking for some of the old off flavors, the chemical components that they made early on. They'll actually go back and eat them. And so I suggest you do that with all your beer styles. If you're doing an IPA, a pale ale, a lager, anything, always have that last few days where you allow it to raise its temperature just a bit and let it consume whatever components might have been left behind. So this will probably have about 12 days, 14 days in fermentation total. And then actually this is a great one if you don't currently have a kegging system. It's one of the best ones for you to be able to bottle condition, because it really, I feel like it gets to its best point at about 3 months. 4 months. Usually that's when it's done its best in competition, and it's fun to mess around with adding Brett and stuff like that. It's just a great base for you to play around with. In fact, this one I'm going to be splitting up into 2 halves. There will be the regular Saison that had the orange and the coriander, and then the other half I'm going to actually add a bunch of lemon peel and ginger to, just so I can get kind of a cool Asian fusion style flavor to it. Yeah, it's a great one to be able to mess around with, have fun with it. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to put out some more videos with some more recipes soon. Keep brewing.